April 6th, 1945, 50 miles west of Okinawa. The radar operator aboard the destroyer USS Laffey watched his screen bloom with contacts. Not a handful of bogeys, not a raid, an avalanche. 22 aircraft inbound, closing fast from the north. His voice cracked over the intercom with practiced calm that barely masked the terror underneath. Multiple bandits bearing 015, range 12,000 yards, speed 200 knots, descending. On the main deck, gunner's mate second-class Robert Johnson pressed his face against the rubber eyepiece of his 40mm mount and waited. The Mark 14 computing gun sight mounted to his weapon hummed softly, gyroscopes spinning inside their sealed housing. Through the reflector glass, he could see the reticle, a glowing orange circle that seemed to float in midair, disconnected from anything solid. The first zero appeared as a speck against the grey morning sky. Johnson's hands moved automatically, tracking the target as it grew larger. But something felt fundamentally wrong. Every instinct in his body, every hour of hunting deer in Pennsylvania hills, every childhood afternoon throwing rocks at bottles, screamed at him to aim directly at that aircraft, to put the reticle on the target and fire. Instead, following doctrine drilled into him through weeks of training that felt like brainwashing, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He kept the glowing circle aimed at absolutely nothing. Empty sky. Vacant air 3 aircraft lengths ahead of where the zero actually was. His fingers found the trigger. The 40mm cannon roared. And 2.3 seconds later, the zero that had been racing toward empty space flew directly into a stream of shells that tore its engine apart in a spray of burning oil and shredded aluminum. Johnson had just proven a mathematical truth that would save the USS Laffey and hundreds of other ships during the bloodiest naval campaign of the Pacific War. When facing an enemy willing to die by flying directly into your vessel, the only way to survive was to shoot at places where nothing existed yet, to fire at the future, to trust mathematics over every human instinct, refined across millions of years of evolution. This counterintuitive principle, called predictive fire control, would transform American naval gunners from men desperately trying to stop the unstoppable into precision marksmen who could create walls of steel in the sky exactly where kamikazes would be. But the journey to this revelation had begun 3 years earlier, 10,000 miles away, with men who had no idea they were about to face an enemy that redefined what terror meant. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The smoke hadn't even cleared from Battleship Row when the United States Navy's Bureau of Ordnance began analyzing why American anti-aircraft fire had been so catastrophically ineffective. The Japanese attack had lasted approximately 2 hours. American ships and shore batteries had fired thousands upon thousands of rounds. The official count, compiled over months of investigation, documented over 9,000 anti-aircraft shells expended. Confirmed kills from that expenditure. 9 aircraft, maybe 10 if you counted the optimistic assessments. That meant American gunners were burning through roughly 1,000 rounds per kill. The mathematics were unsustainable. At that rate, the Navy would exhaust its ammunition stocks before making any meaningful dent in Japanese air power. The problem wasn't courage. Sailors had manned their guns under direct attack, firing until barrels glowed red. The problem wasn't equipment. The 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns aboard destroyers and cruisers were excellent weapons, capable of firing 22 rounds per minute out to 18,000 yards with shells that could tear an aircraft apart. The problem was the targeting, or more precisely, the fundamental impossibility of what gunners were being asked to do. Hit a target moving at 250 miles per hour, possibly maneuvering, at ranges where a 5-inch shell required 4 to 6 seconds of flight time. In those 6 seconds, an aircraft travelling at 250 miles per hour covered over 2,000 feet. If you aimed directly at the aircraft, your shell would arrive at a point in space the aircraft had vacated 6 seconds ago. You would miss, you would always miss. Unless you could predict exactly where the aircraft would be when shell and target occupied the same point in space, The British had understood this problem since 1940. Their solution was the high-angle control system, a mechanical computer the size of a refrigerator that took inputs on target bearing, range, altitude, and speed, then calculated firing solutions. But these systems were massive, required extensive crew training, and worked best against level bombers flying steady courses. They were far less effective against fighters and dive bombers making radical maneuvers. The Americans needed something different, something that could be mounted on individual gun mounts, something that gave every gunner, not just fire control directors in armored citadels, the ability to predict the future. That solution emerged from an unlikely source, not military officers, but civilian scientists who thought in differential equations and understood that modern warfare was becoming a mathematical contest as much as a test of courage. Cambridge, Massachusetts, January 1942. The Radiation Laboratory at MIT, officially formed to develop radar technology, had quietly expanded its mission to include fire control systems. The physicists and engineers working there understood something that traditional military thinking struggled to accept. Human reaction time and human instincts were now liabilities in combat, not assets. Dr. Ivan Getting, a physicist who would later help develop the global positioning system, stood before a chalkboard covered in equations and explained the problem to a room full of Navy officers who looked increasingly uncomfortable. The human eye, he said, requires approximately 0.2 seconds to register a change in visual information and transmit that to the brain. The brain requires another 0.1 seconds to process and initiate a muscular response. The gunner's hands require another 0.2 seconds to adjust aim. Add mechanical lag in gun traverse systems, and you have a total delay of roughly 0.6 to 0.8 seconds between stimulus and response. An aircraft traveling at 300 feet per second covers 240 feet in that span. You are always aiming at history, not the present. Forget the future, one officer interrupted. So what's the solution? Make men react faster? Getting smiled thinly. No, we remove men from the prediction loop. We build machines that can calculate where the target will be faster than human neurology can process, where the target is. The concept was radical, not augmenting human decision-making, but replacing it for the specific task of computing lead angles and deflection. Gunners would still acquire targets, track them, and fire. But the actual aiming, the critical question of where to point the barrel, would be handled by electromechanical computers solving second-order differential equations in real time. The mathematics involved were brutal. You needed to account for target range, which changed continuously, target angular velocity across the gunner's field of view, projectile ballistics, including muzzle velocity, shell weight, and drag coefficients, the gun platform's own motion if mounted on a ship, gravity's effect on shell trajectory over distance. And you needed to solve all these variables simultaneously, updating the solution 20 to 30 times per second as conditions changed. Human brains simply couldn't do this. Even trained mathematicians with paper and pencils required minutes to calculate a single firing solution. By the time they finished, the target would be gone, the variables would have changed, and the solution would be worthless. But electromechanical computers, analog systems built from gyroscopes, resolvers, potentiometers, and servo motors, could perform these calculations continuously at speeds that made human thought look glacial. The Mark 14 gun sight, developed by Bell Telephone Laboratories based on MIT's theoretical work, was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, disguised as a simple aiming device. From the outside, it looked like a standard reflector sight, a small box mounted near the gun barrel with a transparent glass plate angled at 45 degrees. Gunners looked through the glass and saw a reticle, an illuminated circle or cross, superimposed over their view of the sky. But that reticle wasn't fixed. It wasn't even directly connected to where the gun barrel pointed. Instead, it floated, driven by motors, responding to calculations performed by the computer core. Inside the Mark 14's housing, spinning gyroscopes measured how fast the gunner was tracking the target. These weren't simple spirit levels. They were precision instruments capable of detecting angular velocities down to fractions of a degree per second. As the gun mount rotated to follow a target, the gyroscopes experienced torque. That torque, converted into electrical signals, told the computer how fast the target was moving across the gunner's field of view. Potentiometers, variable resistors adjusted by control knobs, provided additional inputs. Target range, set by estimation or radar data. Target type, which determined assumed speed. Ballistic data for the specific ammunition loaded. The computer core, a mechanical resolver system, took all these inputs and performed continuous integration. The output drove servo motors that adjusted the reticle position, moving it ahead of where the gun actually pointed by an angle calculated to compensate for target motion and projectile flight time. The gunner's job became almost absurdly simple. Track the target smoothly, watch the reticle move ahead of the target, leading it. Place that reticle on a patch of empty sky. Fire. Trust that mathematics and physics would bring shell and aircraft together in the future. Simple in concept, psychologically devastating in practice. The first field tests happened aboard destroyers in Chesapeake Bay during summer 1942. Navy crews mounted prototype Mark 14 sights on 40mm Bofors guns and fired at radio-controlled drones towed behind aircraft. The results, documented in Bureau of Ordnance technical reports, showed immediate and dramatic improvement. Gunners using conventional ring sights achieved hit rates around 3% in these trials. 1 hit for every 33 rounds fired. Gunners using the Mark 14, even with minimal training, achieved hit rates exceeding 15%, 1 hit for every 6 or 7 rounds. More significantly, the improvement came without requiring experienced gunners. Raw recruits with no prior gunnery experience performed nearly as well as veterans when both used computing sights. The machine was democratizing expertise, but the psychological resistance was intense. Experienced gunners, men with years of practice shooting at targets, struggled more than novices. They had muscle memory built on thousands of rounds fired using direct aim methods. They would track the target, see the reticle move ahead, and instinctively drag their aim back toward the visible aircraft. They couldn't help themselves. Evolution had wired their brains to point weapons at threats, not at empty air adjacent to threats. Training doctrine had to be completely rebuilt. The new manuals were brutally direct. Do not aim at the target. Do not attempt to lead the target yourself. Trust the sight. Aim where the reticle indicates, even if this appears to be empty sky. Your instincts are wrong. The mathematics is correct. Gunnery instructors developed a demonstration that became standard across training facilities. They would have a gunner track a drone with the Mark 14, achieving good hits. Then they would tape over the sight's window, forcing the gunner to aim using only his eyes and the barrel as reference. Hit rates would collapse to near zero. Uncover the sight, trust the machine, and accuracy returned immediately. The lesson was stark. Your eyes are liars. Your instincts will kill you. The machine sees truth. By early 1943, Mark 14 production had ramped to over 1,000 units per month. The Navy was installing them fleet-wide, prioritizing carriers and their escorts. Gunners were being trained in the new doctrine. Trust the lead, aim at ghosts, fire at tomorrow. But the real test wasn't towed drones in Chesapeake Bay. It was coming from the other side of the Pacific, where Japanese naval aviation was about to transform desperation into doctrine and create a threat that would make everything before look like target practice. June 1944, Philippine Sea. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, later nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, showcased the devastating effectiveness of radar-directed fighter interception combined with improved anti-aircraft fire. Japanese carrier aviation lost approximately 600 aircraft over 2 days. American combat air patrols accounted for most kills, but ships' anti-aircraft batteries contributed significantly. Crucially, this battle marked the last time Japanese carrier air groups could launch coordinated mass attacks. After the Philippine Sea, Japanese naval aviation was a spent force in terms of conventional operations. The Emperor's admirals faced an impossible strategic reality. They were losing the war. American industrial capacity was producing ships faster than Japan could sink them. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines. American forces were island-hopping toward the home islands, and every engagement accelerated the inevitable. Traditional naval air tactics, sending trained pilots on missions they expected to return from, had failed. Those pilots were dead. Training pipelines couldn't replace them fast enough, and even fresh pilots with adequate training couldn't overcome the material and technological superiority of American forces. In this context of existential desperation, a proposal that would have been unthinkable in 1941 began circulating among Japanese naval staff. If pilots couldn't reliably hit targets with bombs and return, what if you removed the return part? What if the pilot became the guidance system? What if death wasn't a risk, but the mission? The kamikaze, divine wind, named after the typhoon that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, wasn't invented in a single moment by a single person. It emerged from multiple sources: junior officers proposing desperate measures, pilots volunteering for one-way missions, senior commanders calculating that one plane with one pilot hitting one target was better mathematics than 10 planes with 10 pilots missing 10 targets, and maybe 3 planes returning. The first organized kamikaze unit, the Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, Special Attack Unit, formed in October 1944, under the command of Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi. The concept was brutally simple: load an aircraft with explosives, point it at an enemy ship. The pilot steers it all the way to impact. No bombs to miss. No need to escape anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft itself becomes the weapon, and the pilot's death ensures accuracy. From a cold mathematical perspective, it was sound doctrine. A conventional bomber attempting to hit a destroyer might have a 5% success rate. A kamikaze, if it reached the target, had closer to 60% success rate because the pilot could make corrections all the way to impact. For a nation losing its trained pilots anyway, trading certain death for dramatically improved hit probability made a horrific kind of sense. But it created an unprecedented challenge for American defenders. Every previous aerial threat, bombers, torpedo planes, fighters making strafing runs, all shared one characteristic: they wanted to live. Pilots would break off attacks if defenses were too heavy. They would take evasive action when targeted. They had survival instincts you could exploit. Kamikazes had none of that. They were already dead, psychologically committed before launch. They wouldn't break off. They wouldn't evade except to improve their attack angle. And they would keep coming until physically destroyed or successfully crashed. This meant traditional anti-aircraft doctrine, which relied on suppressing attacks and forcing bombers to drop early or fighters to break away, was useless. You had to kill them. Not damage. Not discourage. Kill. And you had to kill them far enough away that their momentum and any remaining control surfaces couldn't carry them into your ship anyway. The first large-scale kamikaze attacks hit American forces off Leyte Gulf in the Philippines during late October 1944. The results were sobering. The kamikazes achieved a hit rate that shocked Navy analysts. Approximately 19% of kamikazes that reached attack range scored hits or damaging near misses. That was nearly 4 times the success rate of conventional bombing attacks. Ships started sinking. Sailors started dying. And the mathematical reality became clear. If Japan could sustain kamikaze operations, if they had enough pilots willing to die and enough aircraft to carry them, they could make the invasion of Japan impossibly costly in American lives and ships. The Navy's response was systematic and comprehensive. Fighter combat air patrols were extended outward, trying to intercept kamikazes before they reached the fleet. Radar picket destroyers were positioned 60 to 80 miles out, providing early warning and additional interception opportunities. And crucially, every anti-aircraft gun in the fleet was equipped with either Mark 14 computing sites or their larger cousins, the Mark 37 and Mark 56 directors that controlled main battery guns in dual-purpose mounts. The doctrine became clear: create concentric rings of fire, fighters at maximum range, 5-inch guns engaging at 10 to 15,000 yards. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 40mm guns at 4 to 6,000 yards, 20mm guns for last-ditch defense inside 1,000 yards. And every gun would use predictive fire control. Every gunner would aim at empty sky, trusting mathematics to fill that sky with steel exactly when the kamikaze arrived. April 1st, 1945. The invasion of Okinawa began with massive bombardment from battleships and cruisers, followed by amphibious landings that secured beachheads faster than expected. The Japanese response, predictably, was kamikaze attacks on an unprecedented scale. Operation Tengo, the naval defense plan, called for waves of kamikazes to destroy invasion shipping and make the campaign unsustainable. Over the next 3 months, approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties would be launched against American forces off Okinawa. The concentration of attacks on radar picket destroyers was particularly intense. These ships, positioned on the periphery of the invasion fleet to provide early warning of air attacks, became preferred targets. They were alone, or in small groups. They couldn't rely on the massed anti-aircraft fire of the main fleet, and destroying them would blind the American early warning system. It was sound tactics. It was also sending destroyers into a nightmare that would test the limits of human endurance and the effectiveness of predictive fire control technology. April 6, 1945. Radar, Picket Station, Number 1. USS Laffey, a Sumner-class destroyer commissioned just months earlier, rode the gentle Pacific swell 60 miles northwest of Okinawa. Her radar masts rotated continuously, sweeping the sky for threats. Her crew, at general quarters since dawn, waited with the particular tension that comes from knowing you're a deliberate target. At 0730 hours, the radar plot lit up, multiple contacts inbound from the north. The air defense officer counted them off. 22 aircraft. No, correction. 24. Correction. 30. Correction. Contact saturation. Unknown total. Call in air support immediately. The Combat Air Patrol, 4 Marine Corsairs, dove into the incoming raid and started slashing kamikazes out of the sky. But there were too many. The Corsairs couldn't stop them all. At 0742 hours, the first Zero broke through and dove toward Laffey. On the 40mm mounts, gunners tracked the target. The Mark 14 sights hummed. Reticles floated ahead of the diving aircraft. Gunners fired where the sights commanded. The Zero flew into a wall of shells that tore its wing off at the root. It cartwheeled into the sea 400 yards from the ship. Second, Zero. Third, fourth. The attacks came so fast that gunners barely had time to shift targets. Fire control doctrine said to track smoothly. Let the sight compute. Fire when the reticle aligned. But when targets were coming from multiple vectors simultaneously, doctrine became improvisation. Gunners picked the closest threat, tracked for 2 seconds, fired a burst, then swung to the next threat. The Mark 14s continuously recalculated. Gyroscopes measured each new tracking rate. Computers solved new deflection angles. Reticles jumped to new positions ahead of new targets. Gunners followed where the sights led and kept firing. At 0751 hours, a Zero got through. It struck the fantail at the waterline, exploding and killing 3 men instantly. Damage control parties responded. Hoses were strung. The fire was contained in minutes. The guns never stopped. At 0756 hours, 2 Zeros attacked simultaneously from opposite sides of the ship. Port and starboard 40mm mounts engaged independently. The computing sites on each mount calculated their own solutions. Both kamikazes disintegrated under converging fire. Both crashed within 100 yards of the ship, close enough that shrapnel peppered the hull. At 0800 hours, a Val dive bomber, already damaged by fighter attack, began its terminal dive from directly astern. The aft 5-inch mount, controlled by a Mark 37 director, engaged at 8,000 yards. The director's radar measured range continuously. The analog computer calculated projectile time of flight, added lead for target motion, and generated firing commands. The 5-inch gun elevated and fired on automatic. The first shell missed ahead. The computer adjusted. The second shell missed astern. The computer adjusted again. Third shell, direct hit. The valve exploded at 4,000 yards, raining debris across the destroyer's wake. The attacks continued without pause. Zeros, Vals, Oscars. Even a twin-engine Betty bomber came screaming in at wave-top height, its profile so large that gunners could see the pilot's face through the cockpit glass in the final seconds. Every gun that could bear opened fire. The computing sights tracked. Reticles led. Shells converged on empty air that stopped being empty. The Betty disintegrated 300 yards out, its bomb exploding underwater and buckling plates below Laffey's waterline. By 0900 hours, Laffey had been hit 5 more times. Fires burned amidships. The after-engine room was flooded. Steering control was lost, then regained through emergency systems. 32 men were dead. 71 were wounded. But the ship was still afloat, still fighting, and still shooting kamikazes out of the sky. The attack finally broke off at 0930 hours. The surviving kamikazes, low on fuel, turned for home. The combat air patrol chased them north, claiming 3 more kills. Laffey's crew counted their expenditures. The 5-inch guns had fired over 800 rounds. The 40mm mounts had fired 6,200 rounds. The 20mm guns, over 12,000 rounds. And they had shot down or damaged 22 kamikazes during an 80-minute engagement that became legendary as one of the most intense air defense actions in naval history. But the critical statistic wasn't the total rounds fired, it was the effectiveness ratio. Post-battle analysis, comparing expenditure rates to confirmed kills, showed that Laffey's gunners achieved approximately 1 kill per 280 rounds of 40mm fire. That was dramatically better than the fleet average, and vastly superior to the 1,000+ rounds per kill that had been standard in 1941. The difference came down to the Mark 14 sights and the training that had taught gunners to trust them. Every gun crew had aimed at empty sky. Every gun crew had watched their reticles lead the targets, and every gun crew had fired where mathematics commanded instead of where instinct screamed. Laffey survived and eventually made it back to port for repairs. Her crew received a Presidential Unit citation, but more importantly, their combat reports provided validation that predictive fire control wasn't just theory. It was the difference between sinking and surviving. The kamikaze campaign off Okinawa lasted from April through June 1945, representing the most sustained air attack on naval forces in history. Japanese forces launched approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties. American forces shot down about 50% of those aircraft before they reached attack range, mostly through fighter interception. Of roughly 950 kamikazes that penetrated to attack positions, American anti-aircraft fire destroyed approximately 580 before impact. That's a 61% kill rate once kamikazes entered engagement range of ship defenses. The remaining 370 kamikazes either hit their targets, near-missed and caused damage, or were splashed so close to ships that their debris caused casualties. The statistics marked a revolutionary improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness. At Pearl Harbor, American gunners expended roughly 1,000 rounds per kill. Off Okinawa, fleet-wide averages showed approximately 300 rounds per kill. Individual ships with well-trained crews and optimal site maintenance achieved ratios as low as 150 to 200 rounds per kill. The improvement came almost entirely from predictive fire control technology and the doctrine built around it. The guns themselves hadn't changed significantly. The 40mm Bofors used off Okinawa was the same weapon used at Midway and Guadalcanal. The 5-inch .38 was identical to pre-war models. But the sighting systems had evolved from simple ring sights to sophisticated analog computers that could predict the future, and gunners had evolved from men aiming at targets to men aiming at mathematical predictions. The cost of defending Okinawa was staggering by any measure. The United States Navy lost 36 ships sunk and 368 damaged during the 3-month campaign. Over 4,900 sailors died, nearly 5,000 more were wounded, but the Empire of Japan lost over 1,100 aircraft to achieve those results. And the exchange ratio, measured in aircraft destroyed per ship sunk, was moving steadily in America's favor as predictive fire control became universal across the fleet. Japanese planners looking at these numbers understood that even with kamikazes, they couldn't prevent an American invasion of the home islands. They could make it costly. They could make it bloody. But they couldn't stop it. The mathematics didn't work anymore. The kamikazes themselves represented the ultimate test of anti-aircraft doctrine because they removed every traditional defense advantage. You couldn't suppress them. You couldn't scare them off. You couldn't exploit survival instincts that didn't exist. You could only kill them outright, and you had to do it fast enough and far enough away that physics couldn't carry them the rest of the distance into your ship. Predictive fire control, aiming at empty sky where mathematics said the target would be, was the only effective counter. The doctrine required absolute trust in machines and in training that felt wrong at every level of human instinct. But it worked. And by summer 1945, that doctrine was so deeply embedded in Navy training and operations that new gunners literally couldn't imagine shooting any other way. The war ended in August 1945 without the planned invasion of Japan. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with Soviet entry into the Pacific War, convinced Emperor Hirohito to accept unconditional surrender. The kamikazes never launched the final mass attacks that had been planned. Thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of volunteer pilots, all prepared for Operation Ketsugo, the defense of the homeland, never flew. But the doctrine developed to counter them didn't disappear with the peace. It evolved. It migrated from mechanical analog computers to electronic systems, from vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits to microprocessors. The Mark 14 gun sight was declared obsolete by 1960 and replaced by systems that could do the same calculations 10,000 times faster. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged through every technological generation. Measure current state, predict future state. Aim at the prediction. Fire before the future becomes the present. Modern naval close-in weapon systems, like the phalanx CIWS, embody this principle at its logical extreme. When a phalanx engages an incoming anti-ship missile, its radar measures the missile's position and velocity. Its computer predicts the intercept point, and its 20mm Gatling cannon fires 4,500 rounds per minute into a volume of space the missile hasn't reached yet. The system doesn't see a target in any human sense. It sees data points, calculates trajectories, and saturates predicted positions with tungsten penetrators. The entire engagement, from detection to splash, happens in under 3 seconds. The gunner's role has been reduced to system monitoring. The human doesn't aim, doesn't track, doesn't fire. The human watches, displays, and ensures the machine is functioning correctly. 30 years of technological evolution transformed humans from operators to supervisors. The Aegis combat system, standard on modern cruisers and destroyers, coordinates dozens of weapons systems simultaneously. Each missile launcher, each gun mount, each defensive system operates on predictive algorithms that calculate intercept points and allocate fire to maximize kill probability while minimizing ammunition expenditure. A single Aegis destroyer can engage multiple targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 100 miles, with each weapon system solving its own prediction equations. The Combat Information Center looks nothing like the cramped gun tubs where Robert Johnson stood off Okinawa in 1945. It's a dark room full of glowing screens where sailors monitor computer systems that do the actual fighting. But the doctrine is identical. Aim at where threats will be. Fire at ghosts. Trust mathematics over instinct. Beyond military applications, the principle propagates through commercial aviation. Air traffic control systems don't just track where aircraft are. They predict where aircraft will be in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, based on flight plans and current vectors. Collision avoidance systems aboard aircraft calculate closest approach points and warn pilots before conflicts develop. Every automated safety system in modern aviation is predicting the future and acting on predictions. The autonomous vehicle collision avoidance systems in modern cars work the same way. Your Tesla or Mercedes doesn't brake because another car is in front of you. It brakes because its computer predicts that another car will be in your path 2 seconds from now if current trajectories continue. The radar measures closing rates, the computer solves differential equations. The brakes activate before human reaction time would even register the threat. Anti-ballistic missile defense systems represent the ultimate evolution of predictive fire control. When an SM-3 interceptor launches from an Aegis destroyer to engage an incoming ballistic missile, it's solving a problem that makes World War II aerial gunnery look trivial. The target is traveling at thousands of miles per hour. The intercept range is measured in hundreds of miles. The time to impact might be 5 minutes. And you need to place a kill vehicle in the exact cubic meter of space where the warhead will be several minutes in the future. The mathematics involved require supercomputers, processing radar data in real time, calculating trajectories that account for Earth's rotation, atmospheric drag, gravitational perturbations, and the fact that both interceptor and target are continuously accelerating. No human could perform these calculations. No human is even asked to try. The entire engagement is automated from detection to splash. Humans authorize the launch. Machines do everything else. This represents the ultimate conclusion of the philosophy that began with Ivan Getting and Louis Ridenour watching gun camera footage in 1941. Remove humans from the calculation. Loop. Let machines predict. Let machines aim. Let machines fire. Keep humans in moral authority over the decision to engage, but surrender the execution to systems that can perceive and react at electronic speeds. The gunners who fought off Okinawa would recognize the principle even if the technology looks like science fiction. Aim at empty sky. Trust the numbers. Fire at tomorrow. The human cost of the Kamikaze campaign was staggering and permanent. Over 7,000 American sailors died during the Okinawa campaign, the majority from kamikaze attacks. Thousands more were wounded, many with burns and injuries that they carried for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Men who watched friends die when aircraft crashed through anti-aircraft fire developed trauma responses that in many cases went untreated for decades. The term post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist yet. These men were expected to process their experiences and move on. But the Japanese paid an even steeper price. Over 4,000 kamikaze pilots died during organized special attack operations from October 1944 through August 1945. These weren't just casualties. They were deliberate sacrifices. Young men told their deaths would save the nation, that their spirits would protect Japan even as their bodies burned in aircraft deliberately crashed into enemy ships. Many pilots were volunteers, swept up in cultural narratives about honor and duty. Others were effectively conscripted, given orders that made refusal impossible without dishonoring themselves and their families. The cultural mythology around kamikazes, both Japanese valorization and American demonization, has obscured the human reality. These were mostly teenagers and men in their early 20s. Some believed deeply in their mission. Others went to their deaths terrified and simply trying to fulfill expectations. The surviving writings and letters home reveal complex emotional states that don't fit neat narratives. The American gunners who shot them down didn't have the luxury of complex emotions during combat. The kamikazes were threats to be destroyed, period. But in post-war interviews and memoirs, many veterans expressed complicated feelings: relief at survival, pride in having performed their duty effectively, but also discomfort at having participated in what was essentially industrialized killing where their role was to feed targeting data to machines that turned human beings into wreckage. One veteran, whose name was withheld in the interview, told a Navy historian in 1986, "I did my job. We all did. We aimed where we were trained to aim. We fired when we were trained to fire. We survived because we trusted the machines and the mathematics. But I still see them sometimes. The ones we hit, the way they just came apart. I know they were trying to kill us. I know we had no choice. But knowing doesn't make seeing it any easier." This testimony captures something that pure technical analysis misses. Predictive fire control doctrine was effective because it worked. But effectiveness doesn't erase the human cost paid by everyone involved. The men in the gun tubs, the pilots in the cockpits, all of them caught in a war that had evolved beyond anything their training or their culture had prepared them for. The legacy of World War II aerial gunnery doctrine extends far beyond kill ratios and technical manuals. It represents a fundamental shift in how humans relate to the tools they build for violence. For most of human history, weapons were extensions of the warrior's body and will. You aimed a spear at what you wanted to hit. You swung a sword at the enemy in front of you. Even firearms followed this pattern. You pointed a rifle at a target and pulled the trigger. The connection between intention, action, and result was direct and immediate. Predictive fire control severed that connection. You no longer aimed at what you wanted to hit. You aimed at a mathematical abstraction, a prediction generated by machines. Your intention, kill that aircraft, and your action, fire at empty sky, were divorced from each other. Only the machine mediated the gap between them. This required a profound psychological adjustment. Warriors had to learn to trust tools over instincts refined across millions of years of predatory evolution. They had to accept that machines could perceive truth that human senses couldn't access. This was counter to every cultural narrative about martial skill and personal prowess. The best gunner wasn't the one with the steadiest hand or the sharpest eye. It was the one most willing to let the machine do the thinking. Some veterans embraced this. They found comfort in the idea that mathematics was objective, that following doctrine removed moral ambiguity from their actions. They were performing calculations, not making judgments. Others struggled with it. They felt diminished, reduced to machine operators rather than warriors. The fact that this made them more effective didn't make it feel better. These tensions have only intensified as weapons systems have become more automated. The drone pilot launching Hellfire missiles from 7,000 miles away, the Aegis operator monitoring screens while missiles engage targets beyond visual range, the engineer programming autonomous weapons systems that will make kill decisions without human input. All of them are inheritors of the doctrine developed in World War II. Aim at predictions, not targets. Trust machines over instincts. Remove humans from the perception-action loop to achieve effectiveness impossible through direct human control. The ethical questions this raises aren't hypothetical. They're being litigated in real time through international humanitarian law discussions, military doctrine debates, and the lived experiences of people who operate these systems. But the technical trajectory is clear. Every generation of weapons systems moves further toward automation, toward removing humans from direct control, toward machines making predictions and acting on them at electronic speeds. The gunners who fought off Okinawa were the first generation to really confront this. They weren't the last. By summer 1945, the United States Navy had refined predictive fire control doctrine into a comprehensive system that integrated technology, training, tactics, and organizational structure. Every element supported the core principle. Predict where the threat will be. Create steel walls in that predicted location. Kill threats before they arrive. The training pipeline that produced these gunners was remarkable in its scope and systematization. The Navy established specialized anti-aircraft training centers at facilities, including Great Lakes, San Diego, and Norfolk. New recruits spent 6 weeks learning systems, doctrine, and most importantly, the mental discipline required to aim at nothing visible. Week 1 covered mechanical systems. Students field-stripped 40mm Bofors guns and 5-inch mounts until they could reassemble them blindfolded. They learned failure modes, emergency procedures, and how to maintain weapons under combat conditions. Week 2 introduced the Mark 14 computing site. Students learned the theory behind predictive fire control, not just how to use the site, but why it worked. Instructors used chalkboards to draw vectors and explain differential equations in terms average recruits could grasp. The goal was understanding, not just rote memorization. Week 3 was simulation training. Students sat at mock gun mounts in darkened rooms, while instructors projected aircraft silhouettes on screens. The students tracked targets with unpowered sights, learning smooth tracking technique. No firing, just tracking, building muscle memory for smooth motion. Week 4 introduced live fire with reduced scale systems. Students fired 20mm guns at towed targets while instructors monitored their technique. The emphasis was on trusting the sight, not pulling aim toward the visible target. Students who consistently regressed, who couldn't stop themselves from aiming directly at threats, washed out. Week 5 was full-scale live fire. Students manned actual 40mm mounts aboard training vessels and engaged towed targets at realistic ranges. Ammunition was color-coded, so instructors could identify which guns scored which hits. Performance data was compiled immediately after each exercise. Week 6 was advanced tactics and final examinations. Students practiced engaging multiple targets, worked on fire discipline to avoid friendly fire, and demonstrated proficiency under simulated stress conditions, including deliberate equipment, failures, and complex attack scenarios. The washout rate was approximately 18%. Those who graduated received their gunner qualification and assignment to fleet units. By war's end, the Navy had graduated over 140,000 anti-aircraft gunners through this pipeline. The doctrine they carried to the fleet was identical. Acquire targets visually or via fire control radar, begin smooth tracking, monitor the Mark 14 reticle as it leads the target, aim where the reticle indicates, fire in controlled bursts. Observe fall of shot. Adjust if necessary, but trust the sight. Never aim directly at the target. The results spoke for themselves. Ships with trained gunners and proper equipment survived kamikaze attacks that would have been catastrophic 3 years earlier. The mathematical improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness from 1941 to 1945 was approximately tenfold. This wasn't due to better guns or more ammunition. It came from better prediction of where to aim. The physicists and engineers who developed these systems often described their work in impersonal technical language, improved fire control solutions, enhanced hit probability, optimized engagement parameters. But the human reality was stark. Their mathematics saved lives. American sailors survived because machines could predict the future accurately enough to fill empty sky with steel exactly when kamikazes arrived. Japanese pilots died because their courage and willingness to sacrifice couldn't overcome differential equations solved in real time. The final major kamikaze attack of World War II occurred on August 15, 1945, the day Japan announced its surrender. Several pilots, either unaware of the surrender or unwilling to accept it, launched unauthorized attacks against American ships off Okinawa. Fleet air defense engaged according to doctrine. Combat air patrol intercepted most aircraft. Those that penetrated to attack range encountered predictive fire control. Ships' guns engaged at maximum range, gunners tracked smoothly. Computing sites calculated leads. Shells filled predicted positions. 7 kamikazes were destroyed. None hit their targets. The war ended not with dramatic final combat, but with mathematics performing as designed. When General Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's surrender aboard the battleship USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, he did so surrounded by guns, 5-inch dual-purpose mounts, 40mm Bofors batteries, 20mm Oerlikon guns, every mount equipped with predictive fire control systems. every system representing thousands of engineering hours and millions of dollars of development investment. The guns were silent that day. They would never fire in anger again aboard Missouri. But their presence was a statement. American industrial capacity, scientific expertise, and systematic doctrine development had created weapons systems that couldn't be overcome through courage or sacrifice alone. You needed equivalent technology, equivalent training, and equivalent resources. Japan had none of those. The mathematics of survival had tilted decisively. The Missouri's guns, silent in Tokyo Bay, represented the conclusion of a journey that began with failure at Pearl Harbor and passed through desperate innovation at MIT and Bell Labs. Through brutal validation off Okinawa and countless smaller engagements, through the deaths of thousands of sailors and pilots, through the transformation of human gunners into hybrid systems where machine calculation and human judgment merged into something neither could achieve alone. That hybrid, human gunners trusting machine predictions to aim at empty sky, had proven more effective than either pure human skill or pure automation. And the lesson learned, that prediction is survival, would propagate through every subsequent generation of weapons development. The Mark 14 gun sight was declared obsolete by 1960, replaced by radar directors and analog computers that could process more variables faster. Those systems were themselves replaced by digital computers in the 1970s and 80s. Those were replaced by integrated combat systems in the 90s and 2000s. Each generation increased automation, reduced human control, and moved the prediction horizon further into the future. But the fundamental doctrine remained constant. Aim at where the threat will be. Not where it is, not where it was, where it will be. Calculate that prediction using the best available tools, and act on the prediction before the future becomes the present. This principle, learned in blood off Okinawa, is now encoded in the autonomous systems that defend modern naval vessels. The humans monitoring those systems understand intellectually that machines are aiming at empty sky, that radar-guided missiles are flying toward predicted intercept points, that close-in weapons are saturating volumes of space where threats haven't arrived yet. But they don't feel it the way gunners in 1945 felt it. They don't experience the visceral wrongness of aiming away from a visible threat. They trust the machines because the machines have always worked, because they've never known any other way. The gunners who fought off Okinawa never had that luxury of unexamined trust. They learned to trust machines by consciously overriding instincts, by forcing themselves to do what felt catastrophically wrong, by watching mathematics prove more reliable than evolution. They were the bridge generation between direct human control of weapons and the increasingly automated systems that followed. Their testimony, preserved in interviews and memoirs and after-action reports, documents that transition. The discomfort of aiming at nothing, the terror of trusting machines during combat, the grim satisfaction of survival when doctrine worked as promised, the complicated emotions of killing made industrial and impersonal. One veteran, Gunner's Mate First Class Thomas Bradley, who served aboard the destroyer USS Hazelwood during the Okinawa campaign, wrote in his memoir published in 1988, "We learned to shoot at ghosts. That's what it felt like. You'd track a zero coming in and the sight would tell you to aim 3 plane lengths ahead. You'd fire at empty sky and the zero would fly right into your shells. It worked. It worked every single time if you trusted it. But it never stopped feeling wrong. Even after months of combat, even after dozens of kills, some part of my brain was always screaming to aim at the plane, not at where the plane would be. The training made us do it anyway. The discipline made us trust the math. And we survived because we were better at trusting machines than the Japanese were at being willing to die. I don't know if that makes us better warriors, but it made us alive warriors. And in the end, that's what mattered." This testimony encapsulates the transformation that predictive fire control doctrine demanded. Not just technical proficiency, but psychological rewiring. The ability to perform actions that violated every instinct, to trust abstract mathematics over concrete perception, to become part of a hybrid system where human and machine each contributed what the other couldn't provide. The Japanese kamikazes represented the opposite philosophy: pure human will, absolute commitment, sacrifice as the ultimate tactical advantage. It was a philosophy rooted in cultural values and spiritual traditions that viewed death in service as transcendent. But it collided with American materialism and technological faith, and in that collision, mathematics won. Not because mathematics was morally superior, not because sacrifice was meaningless, but because differential equations solved correctly produce accurate predictions, and accurate predictions, when acted upon with proper weapons, kill aircraft before they reach their targets. The strategic impact of this technological and doctrinal superiority is difficult to quantify precisely, but the broad outline is clear. Japanese kamikaze operations, from October 1944 through August 1945, sank approximately 50 American ships and damaged hundreds more. But Japan lost over 4,000 aircraft, and pilots achieving those results, and the exchange ratio steadily worsened as American defenses improved. By spring 1945, kamikazes were being destroyed at rates approaching 60 to 70% before reaching targets. The remaining 30 to 40% that got through faced overlapping fire from multiple ships, each using predictive fire control. And even successful hits often involved aircraft so damaged by defensive fire that their explosive effect was reduced. Japan couldn't sustain these losses. More importantly, American planners calculating the costs of invading the Japanese home islands concluded that even with massive kamikaze attacks, the invasion was feasible. The kamikazes could make it bloody, but they couldn't prevent it. That calculation, cold and mathematical, influenced the decision to use atomic weapons. If conventional invasion was militarily possible despite kamikazes, then the strategic calculus changed. You could choose alternatives that avoided the projected hundreds of thousands of American casualties. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were driven by many factors: political, strategic, and temporal. But one factor was the confidence, based on Okinawa combat data, that American forces could survive anything Japan could throw at them. That confidence came from predictive fire control doctrine and the machines that enabled it. The mathematical superiority that let gunners shoot down kamikazes translated into strategic options that ended the war without invasion. In this sense, the Mark 14 gun sight and the doctrine built around it didn't just save individual ships. It changed the strategic landscape of the Pacific War's conclusion. History is written by survivors, and the survivors of the Pacific War's final campaigns were overwhelmingly American. Their accounts emphasize technological superiority, superior training, and the effectiveness of systematic doctrine development. These accounts are accurate, but they're also incomplete. They don't capture the experience of kamikaze pilots climbing into aircraft they knew they wouldn't return from, trying to reconcile cultural demands for sacrifice with the human desire to live. They don't address the question of whether courage can be measured against mathematics, or whether comparing them even makes sense. These absences aren't accidents. They're inherent in how wars get remembered. The victors document their path to victory. The defeated, especially those who died, don't get to tell their side. This asymmetry means the story of predictive fire control doctrine is told primarily as a triumph of American ingenuity and industrial capacity. That narrative is true, but it exists alongside other truths: Japanese desperation, the horror of industrialized killing, the psychological cost paid by everyone involved, victors and vanquished alike. A complete accounting would include all of these. But complete accountings are rare in military history. What remains is the technical legacy, the doctrine, the training methods, the systematic approach to turning counterintuitive mathematics into life-saving action, and the fundamental lesson learned by gunners in the Pacific and taught to every subsequent generation of weapons operators. Your eyes are liars. Your instincts are wrong. The machine sees truth. Trust the prediction. Aim at empty sky. Fire at tomorrow. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.